Keep a copy of the waiver in my desk drawer. Not framed. I'm not that kind of person. Just folded twice and tucked behind the ship's maintenance ledger where nobody looks. Sometimes when a new posting comes in and the junior staff start complaining about how little we get, how undermanned we always are, how the brass back home could not possibly care less about a 7-person relay tender floating at the edge of surveyed space, I think about pulling it out. I never do. It would only raise questions I don't feel like answering. The Vethlorn arrived in the early watch of a Wednesday, which I remember because I had been trying to reconcile a discrepancy in our coolant. Transfer logs and Wednesdays are always when the system timestamps roll over and corrupt the prior week. I heard the proximity chime, heard Lieutenant Okafor acknowledge it on the bridge, and went back to my columns. 7 people on a tender do not scramble for a contact. There is nowhere to scramble to. By the time I made it up to the engineering observation bay, because Okafor asked me to bring the manifest, because I was alarmed. 3 of their inspection skiffs had already docked. The Vethlorn are tall, longer in the torso than the leg, with those jointed necks that let them swivel their heads nearly all the way around. The delegation that came through our airlock numbered 11, which is interesting in retrospect, 11 of them to inspect 7 of us. At the time, I did not find it interesting. I was still thinking about the coolant logs. Their senior inspector introduced himself as Assessor Delegate Vale. He had a translation collar and an aide who carried a physical record slate, which I respected on instinct before I could stop myself. I am, above all things, a person who respects a physical record slate. He informed us, through the collar's flat rendering of his language, that the Concord Inspection Authority was exercising its routine right of survey under Protocol 9, Clause 2, and that we were expected to cooperate fully and make no obstructions. Okafor said that was fine. I asked if they wanted coffee. Shh. The caller rendered this as a query about a hot liquid stimulant, and Vale looked at me for a moment before deciding it was not worth a response. They spread through the ship. 11 inspectors cataloging 7 crew members, and a vessel that, I will grant them, was not impressive to look at. The Meridian Compact had been a fast courier in a previous life, and had been converted to relay tender duty when her drives got too old for cargo runs. She had a bridge the size of a walk-in closet, an engineering deck that doubled as a storage bay, a mess that seated 5 if 2 of them did not mind the door, and a hull that had been patched in 11 places that I had personally documented. I documented everything. That was my job. Vale conducted his walkthrough of engineering with the energy of a person touring a property he had no intention of purchasing. He moved through slowly, dictating observations to the aide's record slate, occasionally pausing to examine something with the detached interest of a person who cannot quite believe the thing is real. He stopped at the secondary coolant coupling for a long moment. It was held in place with a brace I had fabricated from a docking clamp housing and 3 lengths of tension wire, because the original full fitting had cracked 8 months prior, and the replacement was on back order. It worked. It had worked for 8 months. It would continue to work. I did not explain any of this because he did not ask. At one point, 2 of the other inspectors were talking near the bulkhead, and the collar translated enough for me to catch the substance. They were noting that the entire crew complement was below the Concord's minimum threshold for a vessel of our registered class, below the threshold for a combat posting, below the threshold, apparently, for a great many categories they had on their lists. One of them said something with a rising inflection, and the other one made a sound I had learned to read by then as laughter. Not cruel. Just the comfortable amusement of people who are certain they are looking at something that does not matter. Vale came back to me. I was sitting at the engineering terminal, still working on the coolant logs, because the inspection did not require my participation beyond making the manifest available, and told me, through the collar, that the Concord Authority would be filing a minimal presence waiver on behalf of our vessel. I asked him to spell out the citation. He seemed briefly surprised that I wanted the citation. He gave it to me anyway. Article 7, Subclause 4 of the Concord Exemption Protocols, Revision 14. He said it as though he were doing me a favor. A notation, he explained, that a vessel's crew complement and operational classification fell below the threshold of required assessment. A formality. A way of recording, officially, that we were not worth the paperwork of a full inspection. I wrote it down. I write everything down. That is, as I said, my job. They finished in about 2 hours. Vale's aide stamped the record slate 3 times. The Vethlorn use a physical stamp for formal proceedings, which I found I respected even more than the slate itself. And Vale told Okafor that the survey was complete, that the waiver had been filed with the Concord authorities relay, and that we were free to continue our operations. Okafor thanked him. Still at the terminal, Vale paused at the airlock. He said something to the aide that the caller did not bother to translate. Then he looked at me, perhaps because I was the only one still visibly doing anything, and he said, through the caller, that we ought to consider requesting a crew augmentation from our home authority. That a vessel operating below Concord minimums was, in his experience, operating at a certain kind of risk. I said I would pass that along. He left. The skiffs undocked. Okafor went back to the bridge, and I heard her telling Petrov something that made Petrov laugh. I sat at the terminal and pulled up the Concord exemption protocols, revision 14, which I had a local copy of, because I have a local copy of everything that touches our operating parameters. Article 7, Subclause 4 was exactly what Vale had described. A minimal presence waiver, filed by an inspection authority on behalf of a vessel, created an official record that said vessel fell outside standard assessment thresholds. I read that part twice. Then I read the next paragraph. Hale had apparently not felt the need to mention. A vessel holding a filed minimal presence waiver was, by the same article, exempted from the Concord authority's jurisdiction for the period covered by that waiver. Exempt from inspection. Exempt from detention. Exempt from any enforcement action under Concord Protocol 9 through 14. The logic was clean, in the way that very old treaty language is often accidentally clean. If a vessel is officially too small to matter, then the apparatus built to govern vessels that matter does not apply to it. The exemption ran for 18 standard months from the date of filing. Thiel had filed it 6 minutes ago. I sat with that for a while. Then I flagged it in the document and forwarded it to Okafor with a note that said, essentially, we should probably know this. She came down to engineering 11 minutes later and read over my shoulder without saying anything for a long time. Then she said, so they can't touch us. I said that was my reading of it. She said for 18 months. I said yes. She stood there another moment. Then she went back to the bridge. I went back to the coolant logs. Timestamp discrepancy turned out to be a calibration error on the tertiary sensor, which I corrected, documented, and filed before end of watch. 3 weeks later, we got a formal inquiry from the Concord Authority asking us to submit to a secondary inspection. I forwarded them a copy of the waiver, along with the relevant subclause, along with the stamp registry number from Vale's aide's physical stamp, which I had written down at the time, because it seemed like the kind of thing worth having. We did not hear back for a while. I do not know what they said to Vale about it. I imagine the conversation was not short. I imagine his aide was in the room. I imagine the physical record slate came up. The waiver is in my desk drawer, folded twice. Behind the maintenance ledger. I don't need it framed. I know what it says.